we've talked a lot about behavioral habits today, but most of the habits that exist in our lives are mental habits. They're habits that we don't even recognize as habits because they're happening inside our brain. And they are incredibly powerful. These mental habits make me believe that when someone cuts me off in traffic, a perfectly appropriate response is to get angry, which does not benefit me, does not change the situation. I know that I should be zen about it, but it compels me to behave a certain way.
So let's say more about that. Let's say more about the mental habits. And I read something the other day, which didn't surprise me one bit, because anybody who has meditated will know this. We have an average of, I believe, 47 thoughts per minute.
Wow. Yeah, that's
right. You're almost one per second.
Right.
And again, if you don't meditate or you haven't spent some time doing mindfulness meditation, you would think that's impossible. But if you've ever done the exercise of sitting there, focusing on your breath, watching every single time you are distracted by a thought, you'll be like, yep, I can believe it's 47 times a minute. So
that actually sounds small to me based on my meditation.
So we've got this crazy thing that is just a thought generating machine that we can't control.
Yeah.
But thoughts are not thinking. So what translates us from thoughts to thinking? How do we form better habits or reformat maladaptive habits around that? You give a great example, by the way, of the reaction to getting cut off, like an anger reaction.
That's absolutely right. So the way that we can influence our mental habits is that we have to deliberately choose to figure out what the cue is, and then we have to give ourselves a reward afterwards. They operate by the same principle as behavioral habits or physical habits, but it's a little bit more tricky, right? So oftentimes, let's take innovation. Innovation is one of a mental habit that's studied. Why do some people manage to innovate on demand much better than others, right? We can all be innovative, but some people, they need the muse to strike. It takes them years. And other people, you walk in and you say, hey, look, I need 30 great ideas by tonight, and they can sit down and they knock them out. So what's happening there? When researchers have looked at the lives of serial innovators, what they found is that the most important part of that is that oftentimes the people who are really good at it have built up what's known as a contemplative routine to spur that innovation. Now, these contemplative routines can be something like, every week I sit down and I reflect on all the good ideas I had last week, just for 30 minutes, and I try and think of good ideas for next week. Or the contemplative routine can be, whenever anyone asks me to come up with 30 ideas, the first thing I do is I go take a walk. And I just think about it in my head. I'm not writing anything down. I'm not committing myself to anything. I'm just letting it percolate a little bit. I have a routine that I know works for me to spark contemplation. Because when you think about it, when it comes to mental routines and when it comes to mental habits and when it comes to success, the most successful people throughout history are the people who can get themselves to think most deeply, right? Making the right choice is so much more powerful than executing really well on the wrong choice. So the question is, particularly in a fast-paced world like today, how do we get ourselves to think more deeply? This is the killer app for our brain. And the way that we get ourselves to think more deeply is to build these contemplative routines that we automatically fall into. Because those contemplative routines push us to think more deeply. And I can give you an example of this if you'd like.
Of course.
Which is, again, we describe this or I describe this in Smarter, Faster, Better. There was a plane, Qantas Flight 32 was a plane, an Airbus A380 that took off from Singapore to Sydney in the early 2000s. And it perfect takeoff. The captain was a great captain. About 10 minutes into the flight, one of the fan blades in one of the jet engines detaches, and it punches this enormous hole in the wing. It also hits another fan blade, and that fan blade explodes, and it was like the shrapnel from a bomb going off inside the plane wing. So within about 12 seconds, there's 14 major systems that are needed to keep a plane aloft. Within about 12 seconds, 12 of those systems had gone offline. No hydraulics, no fuel, no measurements on anything. So the captain, a guy named Richard de Crespigny, he has to figure out how to land this plane safely. This is the worst mid-air mechanical disaster in modern aviation. So what does he do at that moment? What he does at that moment is there's all these alarms going off inside the cockpit. There's all these red flashing things on his board. The computer is telling him, you have to do these 10 things. And as soon as you do those 10 things, you have to do 5 more things. You have to do 13 more things. What he does is he takes his hands off the controls for a second. He closes his eyes and he says to himself, I'm telling myself a story about the plane that I'm flying. And the story in my head is the Airbus A380. And it's really complicated because I have to think about fuel lines. I have to think about hydraulics. I have to think about brakes. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to change the story inside my head. I'm going to change the mental model that I'm using on where to focus. And I'm going to pretend I'm flying a Cessna. Now, a Cessna is the plane that he learned to fly on. It's the plane he feels most comfortable in. And he actually sort of announces this to air traffic control and to his other pilots. And they freak out because they're like, why is this guy talking about flying a Cessna? He's in an Airbus A380. But that moment of contemplation allowed him to access that muscle memory, those habits of flying, and he lands the plane safely. They touch down. All 469 passengers get off. About half an hour later, there's not one injury on board. Now, they've tried to recreate this landing again and again in simulators. Almost every single time it crashes. So what did Richard de Crespigny do differently? Why was he able to land that plane? And I've asked him. And what he'll tell you is, he actually doesn't know or remember exactly what he did in the moment. But by changing that mental model in his head, by engaging in this contemplative routine, which felt supernatural to him to say, I need to be in charge here. I need to stop reacting. I'm going to choose to pretend I'm flying a Cessna. That unlocked all of these learned habits of safe flying that allowed him to land that plane.
I'm Peter Attia. This podcast relies exclusively on premium subscribers for support, which allows us to provide all our content without taking a single penny from advertisers. I believe this keeps my content honest, making it a trusted resource for listeners like you. As a premium member, you'll get immediate access to our entire back catalog of AMA episodes and all future AMA episodes. You'll get longevity-focused premium articles packed with actionable insights. You'll get unrivaled show notes for each and every episode of The Drive, every topic, every study, every resource from each episode carefully curated for you. You'll get quarterly podcast summaries where you'll learn my biggest personal takeaways from the previous 90 days of expert guest episodes and much more. This journey doesn't have to be navigated alone. We can take these steps towards a better, longer life together. Become a premium member today at peterattiamd.com/subscribe to join me in a shared commitment to a healthier future.